The work in the exhibition consists of 8 different pieces. 2 of the pieces are theaters in miniature that hang on the wall that have 2 separate characters in them. And then there are 6 pieces that are youth with headdresses on them. And the headdresses are kind of post-industrial architecture as the sort of crown that weigh down the figures. I went to school at Kendall College of Art and Design in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and my focus was working as a furniture maker and as a printmaker. And as I worked through school, I kind of strayed into sculpture, and at some point the printmaking and the furniture making came together into this work that's more figurative and narrative. I was an artist in residence at Penland School of Crafts for 3 years, and so I spent that time building the body of work that's downstairs right now, besides the 2 stages. So the piece that's in the CAM's permanent collection is The Bones Of, and it's a large burnt-out theater that in the center is a man who's dipping roses in black paint. And in that particular piece, Anne was very drawn to the piece, and we had a conversation during an auction at Penland, and the topic came up for acquiring the piece, and that's also where the exhibition idea came from. Yeah, all of the pieces kind of start out with lots of sketches, sketchbooks. I do a lot of collecting of information online, so I have folders on the desktop of all these different industrial grain silos and kind of dilapidated detritus from post-industry. And so looking at all those images, I come up with an architectural drawing that is unique to itself, but is kind of flavored by all those different things. And those pieces kind of amalgamate into all these sketches, and I come up with the structure of what would be the headdress or a theater. And then as those pieces kind of flesh out and I start to construct the pieces, I also start designing the characters for the pieces, which none of the characters are specific people, but they're also kind of an amalgamation of different photos that I reference from online. So I'll find a specific way that a lip curls, or the glance that somebody has, or the look on the face, and I'll kind of keep those in mind as I'm sculpting, and then as a character starts to show itself, it kind of forms its own sort of characteristics and its own personality. I'm influenced by all sorts of work, actually. One thing that comes to mind first is film. I think that's probably one of maybe the most effective forms of art sometimes. And I think a lot of the auteur filmmakers like Wes Anderson or Terry Gilliam or Stanley Kubrick, where they're actually creating an entire atmosphere in a world that is from their mind directly, not really taking place in our own world. And so that's really inspired the theaters and having that space that somebody can see and walk into in their mind. And then it also ends up flavoring the headdresses on the younger youth as well, because there's kind of an entire narrative space that the viewer can walk around and kind of step into outside of their world. So when I'm starting off a piece and I have the sketches and the drawings, I usually start with the architectures first, and so I'll actually detail blueprints of the specific pieces from different points of view, from a horizontal view and then from a top view, and then start constructing all the pieces. A lot of the components are made out of bent laminations, and so those pieces have to be made and basically make a stockpile of those to build the architectures. And as the architecture starts to come together, I'll start carving the figure side by side, and I'll bounce back and forth at that point between the architectures of the headdress and the figure, and as the pieces come closer to completion, it becomes a layer, becomes a painting issue. So I'll end up layering multiple layers of paints, of stains, of watercolors, in order to try to get the patina that I want on the pieces that looks aged. And the figures too get layered up with probably about 35 layers of gesso and different colored paints, and then wet sanded into to kind of reveal the different layers and strata of the skin. The architectural components, I've always been interested in architecture, and always kind of fascinated by bridging structures and really large buildings. And I think that kind of arrived in the work through the furniture making, when the printmaking of figurative pieces and then the architecture of furniture kind of came together, and it just made sense. I was already making all these technical spaces that people would live with, and then it became a space of where a character might live inside, or what the mental space might look like on top of the character. And that's when thinking about actually mental space is how that came about. In the theaters, I was thinking about these characters and where they're living. And with the younger characters, I started thinking about the inheritance of that generation, kind of that being placed on their head before it kind of grew into something that they were inside of. And I don't really leave a lot of room for variables in that work, although some have presented themselves. I finished a piece that I had accidentally knocked down right before photos and then had to put back together again. And so through that event, and I guess also through the use of fire, there's a lot of controlled burning that happens in the pieces, and I used that as kind of a way to make like a lost and found contour drawing within the work. And there's something that draws people into shapes that they have to actually finish with their minds, and I think it pulls them in tighter and helps them think about the pieces longer. And so in that way, some of the work is collaborative. There's a specific piece in the exhibition called The King is Dead, and it was in response to the specific architectures and trying to abstract further between objects that people might recognize, like grain towers, water towers. And so in that specific piece, I was inspired by a maple seed pod, little helicopters that fly down. And so that's the kind of basic shape of the headdress. And I was also experimenting with how that fit on the head, rather than being solely a crown, which most of the other pieces are, actually kind of comes over the face and obscures it. And that piece is acting as a maquette for a much larger piece. Currently I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a fellow, and I have a lot of space and a large shop to use, and so I've made that structure at an 18-foot scale. And so being able to use just the images of that piece as a blueprint, I've constructed that, and it will be different, it will be showcased differently. There won't be a carved head inside at that scale, but it'll be more reminiscent of a mask and more as a found object sort of vessel in a gallery environment.